I'll never forget the way Jessica's perfectly manicured fingernails tapped against my kitchen counter as she looked around my studio apartment with barely concealed disgust. The sound echoed off the thin walls of Unit 4B in the Riverside Gardens complex, a place most people in Denver would politely call affordable housing. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Jessica wasn't most people, and she definitely wasn't polite when it came to my life choices. Michelle, seriously? She picked up one of my mismatched coffee mugs, examining it like it might give her a disease. You're 28 years old. Don't you think it's time to stop living like a college student? I stood there in my tiny galley kitchen, wearing my favorite old sweater with a hole near the left elbow, watching my older sister survey my home like a real estate appraiser, delivering bad news. The afternoon sunlight streaming through my single window caught the dust motes floating between us, and I suddenly became hyper-aware of how small everything looked through her eyes. The fold-out couch that doubled as my bed, the card table I used for both dining and working, the mini fridge that hummed a little too loudly in the corner. It's not that bad, I said quietly, though even as the words left my mouth, I knew they sounded defensive. Jessica laughed, not the warm kind of laugh we used to share as kids, but the sharp, cutting sound she'd perfected over the years since landing her corporate job at Morrison & Associates. Michelle, honey, this place costs what, $600 a month? I spend more than that on my car payment. And look at this bathroom. She gestured toward the closet-sized space where I'd hung a shower curtain to hide the rust stains around the tub. The tiles are literally falling off the wall. I wanted to tell her that those $625 represented nearly half my monthly income from the small marketing firm where I worked as a junior graphic designer. That every penny mattered when you were trying to build something from nothing. That maybe, just maybe, there were more important things than Italian marble countertops and walk-in closets. But I didn't say any of that because Jessica had a way of making me feel small, even when she wasn't trying to. Look, I know you think you're being independent or whatever, she continued, running her finger along my windowsill and frowning at the dust. But Mom and Dad are worried about you. We all are. You could be doing so much more with your life instead of hiding out in this place. The word place came out like she was describing a crime scene. I wrapped my arms around myself, suddenly cold despite the Denver summer heat that made my apartment feel like an oven most afternoons. Jessica had always been the golden child, the one who graduated summa cum laude from Colorado State, who landed the six-figure job straight out of college, who lived in a pristine two-bedroom condo in Cherry Creek with floor-to-ceiling windows and a doorman who knew her name. I'm not hiding, I said, though my voice came out smaller than I intended. I'm working. I'm saving money. I'm trying to figure things out. Figure what out? Jessica's voice rose slightly, that familiar impatience creeping in. Michelle, you've been figuring things out for 3 years now. You have a degree in business administration that you're not using. You could be working at a real company making real money, living like an adult instead of playing house in this shoebox. I stared at the scuffed linoleum floor, counting the cracks I'd memorized over the past 18 months of living here. Jessica wasn't entirely wrong, and that was the part that stung the most. I did have a business degree. I could probably get a better job if I really tried. But every time I thought about putting on a suit and sitting in a cubicle, answering to someone else's vision of success, something inside me recoiled. You know what the worst part is? Jessica picked up a stack of my design sketches from the counter, flipping through them like they were grocery store circulars. You actually have talent. These little drawings of yours, they're not terrible. But you're wasting it here, playing around with business cards for local restaurants and flyers for yoga studios. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. You could be working for a real agency, designing campaigns for actual clients. She set the sketches down dismissively, and I felt heat rise in my cheeks. Those little drawings represented months of work, late nights spent perfecting logos for small businesses that couldn't afford the big agencies Jessica thought I should be working for. Mrs. Chen's bakery logo had increased her foot traffic by 30%. The rebranding I'd done for Jake's auto repair shop had helped him expand to a second location. But to Jessica, none of that mattered, because it wasn't prestigious enough, wasn't profitable enough, wasn't enough. I should go, Jessica said, glancing at her Apple Watch. I have dinner reservations at the Capitol Grill with some clients. She paused at my door, her hand on the knob. Michelle, I'm saying this because I love you, but you need to wake up. This whole starving artist thing might seem romantic, but it's not sustainable. You're gonna end up broken alone in places like this for the rest of your life if you don't make some serious changes. After she left, I stood in the middle of my studio apartment, surrounded by the silence that felt heavier than usual. The walls seemed closer together, the ceiling lower, the whole space smaller and shabbier than it had felt that morning. I caught my reflection in the darkened window and saw what Jessica saw. A woman approaching 30, living in a space most people would consider temporary, wearing clothes from Target, surrounded by secondhand furniture and big dreams that maybe weren't quite big enough. I made myself a cup of tea in one of those mismatched mugs Jessica had judged, and settled onto my fold-out couch with my laptop. The screen glowed in the dimming light as I scrolled through job postings, corporate positions that promised steady paychecks and health insurance, and all the markers of grown-up success: Senior Marketing Coordinator, Brand Manager, Digital Marketing Specialist. Each job description blurred together into a wall of requirements and responsibilities that made my chest feel tight. But then I closed the laptop and looked around my tiny apartment again, really looked at it. Yes, the bathroom tiles were falling off. Yes, the refrigerator hummed too loudly. Yes, the whole place could fit inside Jessica's living room with space to spare. But it was mine. Every stick of furniture, every sketch tacked to the wall, every plant crowding the windowsill represented choices I had made, risks I had taken, dreams I was brave enough to chase even when they scared me. The business cards scattered across my card table weren't just little drawings. They were proof that I could create something beautiful and useful, something that helped real people build their dreams. The yoga studio owner had told me that my new logo made her feel proud to hand out her cards for the first time in years. The restaurant owner had framed the menu design I created and hung it behind his register. These weren't billion-dollar campaigns, but they mattered to the people I worked with, and they mattered to me. That night, I lay on my fold-out bed, listening to the sounds of Riverside Gardens settling around me. Mrs. Rodriguez upstairs was practicing piano, the same halting melody she played every evening. The college students next door were having another one of their loud conversations about philosophy and the meaning of life. 2 floors down, Mr. Kim was watching his Korean drama with the volume turned up too high. These weren't the sounds of success Jessica would recognize, but they were the sounds of people living their lives, making do, finding joy in small spaces and simple pleasures. I thought about calling Jessica back, trying to explain why I couldn't just walk away from the life I was building, even if it looked pathetic from the outside. But I knew she wouldn't understand. Jessica measured success in square footage and salary figures. She couldn't see that sometimes the most important work happened in the margins, in the spaces between what looked impressive and what actually mattered. My phone buzzed with a text message. Dinner was amazing. You should really try to get out more instead of hiding in that apartment. Love you. The words were meant to be encouraging, but they landed like tiny stones in my chest. Hiding. That's what she thought I was doing. I got up and walked to my single window, looking out at the parking lot where my 10-year moi, old Honda, sat between a rusted pickup truck and a minivan held together with duct tape. The Riverside Gardens complex wasn't much to look at, especially at night when the security lights cast harsh shadows on the cracked pavement. But every unit held someone's story, someone's struggle, someone's hope for something better. The truth was, I wasn't hiding, I was planning. While Jessica saw failure, I saw potential. While she saw limitations, I saw possibilities. The question was whether I had the courage to turn those possibilities into reality, especially when the people closest to me couldn't see past the surface of where I was to imagine where I might be going. I pulled out my sketch pad and started drawing, the way I always did when the world felt too big or too small, too judgmental or too limiting. My pencil moved across the paper without conscious direction, creating shapes and lines that gradually formed into something I hadn't expected. It wasn't a logo or a business card design. It was a building, tall and sleek with clean lines and large windows that caught and reflected light. At the base of the building, in flowing script that matched my actual handwriting, were the words, Michelle Torres Design Studios. I stared at the drawing for a long time, this vision that had emerged from some deep part of my subconscious. It was audacious and impossible, and exactly the kind of dream Jessica would dismiss as unrealistic. But sitting there in my tiny apartment, surrounded by the evidence of small successes and incremental progress, I felt something shift inside me. Maybe Jessica was right that I needed to make some serious changes. But maybe those changes didn't have to look the way she thought they should. The next morning, I woke up with the drawing still clutched in my hand and a strange sense of purpose humming in my chest. Outside my window, Denver was waking up, thousands of people getting ready to spend another day building toward their version of success. Some of them would sit in corner offices making decisions that affected hundreds of employees. Others would serve coffee with a smile, or teach children to read or fix broken cars with grease under their fingernails. All of it mattered. All of it was valuable. I made coffee in my tiny kitchen, the same bitter, instant coffee I drank every morning, and looked at my reflection in the bathroom mirror with its falling tiles. The woman looking back at me didn't look like someone who belonged in a corporate boardroom or a luxury condo, but she didn't look like someone who was hiding, either. She looked like someone who was getting ready to surprise a few people, starting with herself. The sketch of the building sat on my card table next to my laptop, impossible and audacious and full of promise. I didn't know how to get from where I was to where that drawing suggested I could be, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I wasn't going to spend the rest of my life apologizing for the size of my apartment or the modesty of my dreams. If Jessica wanted to measure my worth by square footage and salary figures, she was going to be very surprised by what I was planning to build. The morning sun streamed through my single window, illuminating the dust motes that danced between my mismatched furniture and secondhand decorations. But for the first time since Jessica's visit, I didn't see poverty or limitation. I saw potential, waiting patiently for me to be brave enough to claim it. The real work was about to begin, and it was going to happen in the least likely place anyone would expect success to grow. Right here, in Unit 4B of the Riverside Gardens complex, where dreams were apparently too small to matter to anyone except the person brave enough to dream them. Looking back, I can pinpoint the exact moment when Jessica and I stopped being sisters who happened to be different and became competitors in a game I didn't even know we were playing. I was 14, she was 17. And we were sitting in the guidance counselor's office at Lincoln High School, while Mrs. Patterson explained why Jessica would be receiving the Presidential Academic Excellence Award at graduation. "Your daughter is truly exceptional," Mrs. Patterson gushed, her eyes bright with the kind of pride usually reserved for discussing Olympic athletes. "Harvard has already expressed interest, and with her SAT scores, I wouldn't be surprised if she receives multiple full-ride offers." Jessica sat perfectly straight in her chair, hands folded in her lap, wearing the pleased but modest expression she'd perfected over years of collecting awards and accolades. I slouched in the corner chair, still wearing my paint-stained art smock from Mr. Rodriguez's class, watching my parents beam at their golden child like she was performing miracles instead of just being really good at memorizing textbooks. "And Michelle," Mrs. Patterson added, almost as an afterthought, "is doing well in her creative classes. Very artistic. I'm sure she'll find her own path eventually." Find her own path eventually. Even at 14, I understood that this was adult speak for, "We have no idea what to do with this one." My parents nodded politely, but I could see the subtle shift in their expressions, the way hope dimmed just slightly when the conversation turned to their younger daughter's less quantifiable talents. That night at dinner, Jessica regaled us with detailed plans for her future. Pre-law at Harvard, then Columbia Law School, then a position at a prestigious firm where she'd work her way up to partner before she turned 35. She had spreadsheets, for God's sake. Actual color-coded spreadsheets mapping out the next 15 years of her life with the precision of a military operation. "What about you, Michelle?" Dad asked, cutting into his pot roast with surgical precision. Any thoughts about college applications? You'll be a senior before we know it. I pushed my mashed potatoes around my plate, trying to formulate an answer that wouldn't sound completely pathetic next to Jessica's master plan. I was thinking maybe art school? Or design? There's this program at Denver Art Institute that looks interesting. The silence that followed felt like it lasted for hours, though it was probably only seconds. Mom cleared her throat delicately, the way she did when she was choosing her words carefully. Honey, art is wonderful as a hobby, but you need to think practically about supporting yourself. Maybe you could study business and minor in art? Or communications, Jessica chimed in helpfully. That's broader, more versatile. You could work in marketing or public relations, something stable with room for advancement. I wanted to scream that I didn't want room for advancement in someone else's company. I wanted to create things that hadn't existed before I imagined them into being. I wanted to see my designs on billboards and business cards and websites, not because they would make me rich or famous, but because they would make the world a little more beautiful. But at 14, sitting at our dining room table while my family discussed my future like it was a problem that needed solving, I didn't have the words to explain any of that. We'll figure it out, I mumbled, which was apparently the wrong answer because it earned me concerned looks from both parents and a pitying headshake from Jessica. The next 4 years passed in a blur of Jessica's triumphs and my quiet struggles to find where I fit in a family that measured success in GPA points and acceptance letters. Jessica graduated valedictorian, got into Harvard with a full scholarship, and spent her summers interning at law firms where she impressed partners with her work ethic and attention to detail. I spent my summers working at the local art supply store, learning about different types of paper and ink, while helping elderly women pick out watercolor sets and watching kids get excited about their first set of professional colored pencils. When my turn came to apply to colleges, I did what was expected of me. I applied to Colorado State for Business Administration, wrote essays about my career goals in marketing, and tried to convince myself that I could be happy in the corporate world if it meant making my parents proud. I got accepted, enrolled, and spent the next 4 years earning decent grades in subjects that felt like foreign languages to me. Accounting was a nightmare of numbers that never seemed to balance correctly. Economics made my head spin with supply and demand curves that looked like abstract art, but apparently meant something important to people who understood money better than I did. Marketing was better, at least it involved some creativity, but even there I felt like I was learning to manipulate people instead of genuinely help them. The worst part was that I was good at it. Or good. Enough anyway. I graduated with a 3.4 GPA and a degree that looked impressive on paper. My parents threw a small party and invited relatives who congratulated me on my practical choice of major. Jessica called from Boston, where she was finishing her second year at Harvard Law, to tell me how proud she was that I'd finally found some direction. But sitting in my cap and gown, surrounded by classmates who were excited about their entry-level positions at banks and consulting firms, I felt like I was wearing a costume that didn't quite fit. The degree was real, the accomplishment was legitimate, but it didn't feel like mine. It felt like something I'd done to make other people happy, which wasn't the same thing as success, no matter what anyone else believed. After graduation, I moved back to Denver and started job hunting with my shiny new business degree. The interviews all blurred together after a while. Conference rooms with floor-to-ceiling windows, hiring managers in expensive suits asking me about my 5-year plan and my greatest weaknesses. Me giving carefully rehearsed answers about being detail-oriented and goal-driven, while internally screaming about spreadsheets and quarterly reports. I finally landed a position as a junior marketing associate at Pinnacle Consulting, a mid-sized firm that specialized in helping other companies optimize their operations. The office was sleek and modern, all glass and chrome and motivational posters about synergy and thinking outside the box. My cubicle was in a row of identical cubicles, each occupied by someone roughly my age who looked just as uncomfortable as I felt. The work itself wasn't terrible, just soul-crushingly boring. I spent my days creating PowerPoint presentations about market penetration strategies and customer acquisition costs, using clip art and generic templates that made everything look exactly the same. Sometimes I'd catch myself doodling in the margins of reports, little flowers or geometric patterns that had nothing to do with profit margins, but made me feel like myself again, even if only for a few minutes. My supervisor, Brandon, was a 26-year-old with an MBA from Wharton, who wore expensive ties and used business jargon like it was a second language. He'd stop by my cubicle to check on my progress, always ending our conversations with phrases like, "Let's circle back on this," or "We need to leverage our core competencies." I nodded and smiled and pretended to understand why everything needed to be leveraged or optimized or disrupted. Meanwhile, Jessica was thriving in Boston. She called every few weeks to update us on her progress, her voice bright with the confidence of someone who'd found her calling. She'd made law review, landed a summer internship at one of the most prestigious firms in the city, and was already being courted by partners who saw partner potential in her work. During one particularly painful conversation, she mentioned casually that her starting salary after graduation would be more than both our parents made combined. "You should think about going back to school," she suggested during one of our calls. "Get your MBA, maybe specialize in marketing or finance. The earning potential is so much better with an advanced degree." I was sitting in my tiny apartment, which I'd rented with my first paycheck from Pinnacle, looking at a half-finished sketch of a logo design for my landlord's brother's food truck business. He'd asked me to help him for free, just as a favor, and I'd spent the entire weekend working on concepts that made me more excited than anything I'd done at my actual job in months. "I'm doing okay," I told Jessica, though we both knew that was a stretch. My salary barely covered rent, groceries, and my student loan payments. I was certainly not building any kind of impressive savings account or planning for major purchases like a car that wasn't held together with prayer and duct tape. "Michelle, you're 23 years old living in a studio apartment and driving a car that's older than some of your coworkers," Jessica said with the brutal honesty that was both her greatest strength and most irritating quality. "That's not doing okay, that's barely surviving. You're smarter than this." After I hung up, I stared at the logo sketches spread across my card table. They were good, maybe even really good. The food truck owner, Miguel, had been so excited when I showed him the preliminary designs that he'd actually hugged me. His eyes had lit up like I'd just handed him the keys to his dreams, instead of a simple drawing of a taco with stylized lettering. That's when it hit me that I was living two completely different lives. There was corporate Michelle, who wore business casual clothes and attended marketing meetings, and pretended to care about conversion rates and customer lifetime value. And there was real Michelle, who came alive when she was creating something beautiful and useful, who lost track of time when she was working on designs that mattered to actual human beings. The problem was that corporate Michelle paid the bills, while real Michelle was apparently just an expensive hobby that I couldn't afford to indulge. At least, that's what everyone kept telling me, including the voice in my own head that sounded suspiciously like Jessica's carefully modulated tone of practical concern. I lasted 18 months at Pinnacle Consulting. 18 months of quarterly reviews and team-building exercises and presentations about maximizing stakeholder value. I was good at the job, competent enough to earn a small raise and praise from Brandon about my, quote, solid contribution to the team dynamic. But every morning when I walked into that glass and chrome office, I felt a little piece of myself disappear. The breaking point came during a company retreat in Vail, one of those mandatory team-building weekends where everyone was supposed to bond over trust falls and group challenges. We were sitting in a circle, participating in an exercise called dream mapping, where each person was supposed to share their professional aspirations for the next 5 years. When my turn came, I opened my mouth to give the expected answer about advancing to senior associate and eventually marketing director, but what came out instead was, I want to start my own design company. I want to help small businesses create visual identities that make them proud to hand out their business cards. The silence that followed was deafening. Brandon cleared his throat uncomfortably, and I could see my coworkers exchanging glances that clearly said, "Poor Michelle. She doesn't understand how the real world works." The retreat facilitator, aggressively cheerful woman named Linda, smiled indulgently and said, "That's lovely, Michelle. Very creative. But let's think about realistic goals within your current career trajectory." That night, I walked out onto the balcony of the corporate lodge and looked up at the Colorado mountains silhouetted against the star-filled sky. The air was thin and clean, so different from the recycled atmosphere of the office, and I felt like I could breathe properly for the first time in months. I pulled out my phone and called Jessica, even though it was past midnight on the East Coast. "Michelle, is everything okay?" Her voice was alert immediately, the way it always was when something unexpected happened. "I think I'm going to quit my job," I said without preamble. The pause that followed was so long I thought the call had dropped. Finally, Jessica's voice came through, carefully controlled. "Michelle, it's the middle of the night and you're at a company retreat. This doesn't sound like the best time to make major life decisions." "I'm miserable, Jess. Like, soul-crushingly, wake up dreading each day miserable. I spend 8 hours a day doing work that doesn't matter to me, for a company that sees me as a replaceable cog in their machine. I'm good at graphic design. Really good. People get excited when they see the work I do for them. Isn't that worth something?" "Of course it's worth something," Jessica said, her voice gentler now. "But Michelle, being good at something doesn't automatically make it a viable career. You have to think about health insurance and retirement savings and building equity. You can't just walk away from stability because your job isn't your dream job. Most people don't get to do exactly what they love for a living. Why not?" The question hung between us like a challenge. Why shouldn't I at least try? What's the worst that could happen? I fail and end up back in a cubicle? At least then I'd know I tried, instead of spending the rest of my life wondering what if. Jessica sighed, the sound of someone explaining basic math to a child who insisted that 2 plus 2 might equal 5 if you believed hard enough. The worst that could happen is that you end up broke and desperate, taking whatever job you can get instead of building a real career. "Michelle, I love your optimism, but the statistics on small business failures are brutal, especially in creative fields where there's so much competition and so little reliable income." After I hung up, I sat on that balcony for another hour, watching the stars and thinking about statistics and failure rates and all the practical reasons why I should keep my mouth shut and go back to my cubicle on Monday morning. But I also thought about Miguel's face when he saw his food truck logo, about the yoga instructor who'd told me that my business card design made her feel professional for the first time since she'd started teaching, about the florist who'd said my window decals had brought in more walk-in customers than any advertising she'd ever done. Maybe Jessica was right about the statistics. Maybe I was being naive and impractical and financially irresponsible. But maybe, just maybe, I was the kind of person who could beat the odds if I was brave enough to try. The question was whether I had that kind of courage, especially when everyone I loved was telling me I was making a mistake. 2 weeks later, I turned in my resignation letter to Brandon, cleaned out my cubicle, and walked out of Pinnacle Consulting for the last time. My parents were concerned, Jessica was convinced I'd lost my mind, and my bank account was barely enough to cover 3 months of expenses. But for the first time in years, I felt like I was moving towards something, instead of just marking time, until I figured out what I actually wanted to do with my life. The apartment at Riverside Gardens wasn't my first choice, or even my 10th choice, but it was what I could afford on my rapidly dwindling savings. The day I moved in with nothing but a carload of second-hand furniture and a head full of dreams that seemed smaller and less impressive in the harsh light of economic reality, I made myself a promise. I would give myself 1 year to build something sustainable with my design work. 1 year to prove that sometimes the impractical choice was actually the bravest choice. That was 2 years ago. 2 years of ramen dinners and generic coffee, of staying up until 3 in the morning working on logos for restaurants that might pay me in gift certificates instead of cash, of explaining to concerned relatives why I was choosing to struggle when I could be climbing someone else's corporate ladder toward security and respectability. But it was also 2 years of watching small business owners light up when they saw their vision translated into something tangible and beautiful. 2 years of learning that creativity wasn't just a hobby or a luxury, but an actual service that helped real people build their dreams into reality. 2 years of discovering that maybe, just maybe, I was stronger and more resourceful than anyone had given me credit for, including myself. The problem was that strength and resourcefulness didn't show up on tax returns or impress relatives at family gatherings. When Jessica visited and saw my studio apartment with its falling bathroom tiles and mismatched furniture, she couldn't see the progress I'd made or the foundation I was building. She just saw her little sister still struggling, still failing to live up to the potential everyone insisted I had if I would just apply it to something more practical and profitable. What Jessica didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I'd been working on something much bigger than business cards and restaurant logos. Something that would either prove them all right about my impractical dreams, or surprise everyone who'd ever suggested I should find a more realistic path to success. The sketches hidden in my desk drawer weren't just doodles or wishful thinking. They were blueprints for something that could change everything, if I was brave enough to take the kind of risk that terrified everyone who loved me. The question was whether I had learned enough, saved enough, and grown enough to turn those sketches into reality. Whether the girl who'd been told to be practical and realistic had become the woman who could build something extraordinary from nothing but determination and a willingness to bet everything on a vision that existed nowhere but in her own imagination. The call came on a Thursday morning while I was hunched over my laptop, working on a logo design for a pet grooming business called Pampered. Pause. I'd been awake since 4, unable to sleep because my upstairs neighbor had decided to rearrange furniture at midnight, and I was surviving on my 3rd cup of instant coffee and sheer determination. When my phone rang with Jessica's name on the screen, I almost ignored it. Our conversations lately had become exercises in disappointment, with her expressing concern about my life choices and me defending decisions that sounded increasingly hollow even to my own ears. "Michelle, thank God you answered." Her voice was different this time, sharp with an urgency I hadn't heard before. "I need to talk to you about something important. Can you meet me for lunch today?" I looked around my studio apartment, at the morning light streaming through the single window and illuminating the organized chaos of my workspace. Sketches covered every surface, client files were stacked in careful piles, and my computer screen glowed with the half-finished logo that I'd promised to have ready by 5 o'clock. "I'm really swamped today, Jess. Can we talk on the phone?" "No, this needs to be in person. It's about your future, Michelle. Your real future, not this fantasy you've been chasing." The condescension in her voice made my jaw clench, but there was something else underneath it, something that sounded almost like excitement. "Meet me at the Metropolitan at noon." My treat. The Metropolitan was the kind of restaurant Jessica frequented, all white tablecloths and wine lists that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. I hadn't been there since her birthday dinner 2 years ago, when she'd insisted on celebrating at a place where the appetizer started at $18, and the waitstaff spoke in hushed, reverent tones about the chef's special preparation of seasonal vegetables. I almost said no, almost told her I couldn't afford to take 3 hours out of my workday for another lecture about my impractical career choices. But something in her voice stopped me, a quality I couldn't quite identify but that made my stomach twist with unease. "Fine, noon. But I really can't stay long." "Perfect. And Michelle?" "Dress nicely. This is important." After she hung up, I stared at my phone screen, trying to decode the subtext of our conversation. Jessica rarely asked me to dress nicely, unless she was planning to introduce me to someone, usually someone she thought could help redirect my life toward a more acceptable path. The last time she'd made that request, I'd ended up having lunch with her college roommate who worked in human resources at a Fortune 500 company, and spent an hour explaining why my design experience would translate perfectly to a corporate communications position. I spent an extra 20 minutes getting ready, choosing my one good dress and the shoes I saved for client meetings with bigger budgets. The woman who looked back at me from the bathroom mirror appeared professional and put together, nothing like the paint-stained, coffee-fueled designer who'd been working since dawn. It was a costume, really, the outfit I wore when I needed to convince people that I was a legitimate businesswoman, rather than a dreamer playing dress-up in a studio apartment. The Metropolitan buzzed with the kind of energy that came from expense accounts and power lunches. Jessica was already seated at a corner table, looking perfectly at home in her tailored blazer and designer handbag. She waved me over with a smile that seemed brighter than usual, more animated than our typical lunches, where she spent most of the time looking vaguely concerned about my life choices. "You look wonderful," she said as I sat down, and I noticed she'd already ordered wine, an expensive Chardonnay that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a week. "I'm so glad you could make it. I have incredible news." Before I could respond, she launched into an explanation that made my head spin. A senior partner at her firm had a brother who owned a marketing agency in Denver. Not just any marketing agency, but one of the most prestigious in the city, with clients that included major corporations and high-profile nonprofits. The brother was looking to expand his creative team, specifically seeking someone with a fresh perspective and strong design skills to head up their new visual branding division. "He's willing to start someone at $75,000 a year," Jessica said, her eyes bright with the kind of excitement usually reserved for lottery winners. "With full benefits, 3 weeks paid vacation, and opportunities for advancement that could have you managing your own team within 2 years. Michelle, this is exactly what you need. A real position with real growth potential." The number hung in the air between us like a challenge. $75,000 was more than I'd made in the past 2 years combined. It was health insurance and a retirement plan, and the ability to move into a real apartment with separate rooms and functioning appliances. It was everything Jessica had been telling me I needed, wrapped up in a package that looked suspiciously like salvation. "What's the catch?" I asked, though part of me was already calculating how much debt I could pay off with that kind of salary. "No catch." "Well, not exactly." Jessica's smile faltered slightly. "It's a corporate position, so you'd be working on campaigns for their existing clients, rather than building your own client base. And there might not be as much creative freedom as you're used to, at least initially. But Michelle, think about the stability. Think about being able to afford a decent apartment, reliable transportation, maybe even start building some savings." I looked around the Metropolitan, at the other tables filled with people in expensive suits making deals that would affect hundreds of employees and millions of dollars in revenue. This was the world Jessica inhabited, where success was measured in salary figures and corner offices, where creativity was a tool used to serve larger corporate goals rather than an end in itself. "I'd have to stop freelancing," I said, more to myself than to her. "Well, yes, obviously. You couldn't maintain your own clients while working for another agency. But honestly, Michelle, is that such a bad thing? You've been struggling for 2 years, barely making ends meet, living in that depressing apartment with no security and no benefits. This is your chance to step into the adult world." The adult world. The phrase stung more than she probably intended, carrying with it the implication that everything I'd been building, every late night and early morning, every client relationship and creative breakthrough, was somehow childish or insignificant. That the pet groomer who'd hugged me when she saw her new logo, the restaurant owner who'd told me my menu design had helped him attract new customers, the nonprofit director who'd said my brochure design had increased donations by 30%, all of that was just playing pretend until I got a real job. When would I need to start? I heard myself asking, though my voice sounded distant and hollow. "That's the best part. He wants to meet with you tomorrow afternoon. I already sent him your portfolio, the professional pieces you did in college, and he's impressed. This could happen fast, Michelle. You could be employed again by next week." Employed again. As if the work I'd been doing for the past 2 years didn't count as employment because it didn't come with a W-2 form and a corporate health plan. I took a sip of the expensive wine and tried to imagine myself in a conference room, presenting campaigns for clients I'd never met, selling products or services that meant nothing to me beyond their ability to generate billable hours and quarterly profits. "I need to think about it," I said finally. Jessica's expression shifted, the bright enthusiasm replaced by something harder and more frustrated. "Think about what? Michelle, this is a gift. Do you know how hard it is to get an interview at a firm like this, especially without corporate experience? I called in every favor I had to make this happen." "I appreciate that, I really do. But this is my career we're talking about. I can't just abandon everything I've built because someone offers me a steady paycheck." "What have you built?" Jessica's voice rose slightly, attracting glances from nearby tables. "A client list of food trucks and yoga studios, a portfolio of small projects that barely pay your rent. Michelle, I love you, but you have to stop pretending that what you're doing is a sustainable business. It's a hobby that's gotten out of hand." The words hit like physical blows. A hobby that's gotten out of hand. 2 years of 16-hour days, of learning business law and tax codes and client management, of building relationships and reputation, and a body of work that I was genuinely proud of, reduced to a hobby that had simply gone too far. "I'm building something," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the anger burning in my chest. "Maybe it doesn't look impressive to you, but it's mine. Every client, every project, every success and failure, it's all mine. I'm not just a replaceable cog in someone else's machine." Jessica leaned back in her chair, studying me with the expression she'd worn when we were kids, and I'd insisted I could build a treehouse despite having no idea how to use a hammer. Fond exasperation mixed with genuine concern, seasoned with the confidence of someone who'd always known better than everyone around her. "Michelle, listen to yourself. You're 28 years old, living in a studio apartment that most college students would find depressing, driving a car that barely runs, with no savings and no benefits. That's not building something, that's barely surviving. And for what? So you can tell yourself you're an entrepreneur while designing business cards for $25 each." The conversation continued for another hour, but I stopped listening somewhere around the time Jessica started explaining how this opportunity could be the foundation for a real career in marketing, how I could work my way up to creative director and eventually start my own agency with the financial backing and industry connections that came from working within the system. She painted a picture of a future where I wore expensive suits to important meetings, where my name appeared on campaign materials for recognizable brands, where my parents could finally be proud of their younger daughter's professional accomplishments. It was a seductive vision, made more appealing by the fear that had been my constant companion for 2 years. The fear that Jessica was right, that I was deluding myself about my abilities and my prospects, that I was wasting the best years of my career chasing dreams that were too small to matter and too unrealistic to sustain. The job offer was proof that I could succeed in the legitimate business world if I was willing to put aside my stubborn insistence on doing things my own way. But as I walked back to my car after lunch, the expensive wine leaving a bitter aftertaste in my mouth, I couldn't shake the feeling that accepting this position would be the beginning of the end of everything that made me who I was. I would become corporate Michelle again, the version of myself that wore business casual and attended meetings about brand synergy and market penetration, the version that smiled and nodded while slowly disappearing inside a role that felt like wearing someone else's skin. That night, I sat at my card table with the job application Jessica had insisted I fill out, staring at the questions about my career goals and professional aspirations. The answers they wanted were obvious, the kind of corporate speak that would position me as a team player with leadership potential and a passion for integrated marketing solutions. But every time I tried to write those answers, my hand refused to cooperate. Instead, I found myself pulling out the sketch I'd drawn the night after Jessica's apartment visit, the drawing of the building with my name on it that had seemed so impossible and audacious. I'd hidden it in my desk drawer, embarrassed by its presumption, but now I spread it across the table next to the job application and studied both documents like they were competing maps to different futures. One path led to security and respectability, to a salary that would allow me to rent a real apartment and buy a reliable car and make my family proud of my practical success. The other path led into uncertainty, toward a vision so ambitious it terrified me, toward the possibility of failure so complete it would prove everyone right about my impractical dreams. My phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. "Remember, interview tomorrow at 3 p.m. Wear the navy suit if you have it. This is your chance, Michelle. Don't overthink it." I stared at the message for a long time, then looked again at the sketch of the building. The design was cleaner than I'd remembered, more professional and achievable than my memory had suggested. The proportions were right, the lines confident, the overall vision something that could actually exist in the real world rather than just in my imagination. That's when I realized what I had to do, not the safe thing or the practical thing or the thing that would make everyone else comfortable with my choices, but the thing that would prove, once and for all, whether I had what it took to build something extraordinary or whether I really was just a dreamer who needed to accept the limitations of reality. I picked up my phone and called the number Jessica had given me for the marketing firm. When the receptionist answered, I asked to speak with Mr. Richardson about the creative position. She put me on hold, and for a moment I wavered, thinking I could still take the interview, still choose the safe path that led to steady paychecks and traditional success. But when he came on the line, what came out of my mouth wasn't a confirmation of our interview time. "Mr. Richardson, I'm calling about the position your sister discussed with me. I'm honored by your interest, but I've decided to pursue a different direction with my career. I won't be able to meet with you tomorrow." The silence that followed felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down at a drop that could either destroy me or teach me to fly. "I understand," he said finally. "Best of luck with your endeavors." After I hung up, I sat in the quiet of my studio apartment, surrounded by the evidence of 2 years of work that Jessica couldn't see the value in, holding a sketch of a building that existed nowhere but in my imagination. I had just turned down more money than I'd ever made, walked away from security and benefits and everything my family thought I needed. But for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe properly. I felt like myself again, not the version of myself that other people thought I should become, but the woman who'd been brave enough to walk away from a soul-crushing corporate job to build something that mattered to her, even if it mattered to no one else. The real work was about to begin. Not the safe, predictable work of climbing someone else's corporate ladder, but the terrifying, exhilarating work of turning an impossible sketch into an undeniable reality. I didn't know if I had what it took to succeed, but I finally knew that I had what it took to try. My phone rang again, Jessica's name flashing on the screen. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to her message with a mixture of dread and determination. "Michelle, I just got a call from Mr. Richardson. He said you declined the interview? Call me back immediately. We need to talk about this before you make the biggest mistake of your life." I deleted the message without calling her back. Because for the first time, I was absolutely certain that the biggest mistake of my life would be taking a job that required me to pretend I was someone I wasn't, working toward goals that meant nothing to me, building someone else's dreams instead of my own. The sketch of the building seemed to glow in the lamplight, its clean lines and ambitious scale, a challenge and a promise rolled into one. Tomorrow I would start the work of making it real. Not because it was practical or safe or what anyone expected from me, but because it was mine, and I was finally ready to bet everything on the possibility that mine might be enough. The morning after I turned down the corporate job, I woke up with a strange mixture of terror and exhilaration coursing through my veins. My bank account showed exactly $2,347, barely enough to cover 2 months of rent and basic expenses. The sketch of the building sat on my table like a dare, challenging me to turn a piece of paper into something real and substantial enough to change my life forever. I made coffee with my usual instant crystals, but instead of sitting down to work on client projects, I opened my laptop and started researching. If I was going to build something extraordinary, I needed to understand exactly what extraordinary looked like in practical terms. I spent the entire day diving deep into commercial real estate websites, studying floor plans and square footage costs, researching zoning laws and construction permits, learning a vocabulary I'd never needed before but suddenly felt essential to my survival. By evening, my head was spinning, with numbers that seemed impossibly large. Even a modest commercial space in downtown Denver would cost more in monthly rent than I'd made in the past 6 months. The startup costs for a legitimate design agency, complete with proper equipment and professional space, would require a loan so substantial that no bank would even consider someone with my financial profile and irregular income history. But instead of discouraging me, the research had an unexpected effect. It clarified exactly what I needed to accomplish, turning my vague dreams into concrete goals with specific price tags attached. I needed approximately $50,000 for the first year's operations, including rent, equipment, insurance, and marketing materials. It was an astronomical sum for someone whose biggest single payment had been $800 for a complete restaurant rebrand, but it was also finite and achievable if I was strategic about how I approached it. That night, I created what would become my secret weapon over the next 18 months, a detailed business plan that mapped out every aspect of Torres Design Studios, from the initial client acquisition strategy to the projected revenue growth over 5 years. I wrote mission statements and analyzed competitor pricing structures. I designed mock-ups of what the office space would look like, complete with client meeting areas and a workspace large enough for the team I hoped to build someday. Most importantly, I identified the gap in Denver's design market that I could fill better than anyone else. The established agencies focused on large corporate clients with substantial budgets, while the smaller freelancers competed primarily on price for basic services. But there was a middle ground that no one was adequately serving. Growing small businesses and ambitious startups that needed sophisticated design work but couldn't afford the premium agencies' rates. These were companies like the organic meal delivery service I'd worked with 6 months earlier, a business that had exploded from a single food truck to 3 locations but still needed professional branding that could scale with their growth. Or the tech startup developing an app for independent contractors who needed everything from logo design to user interface mockups but couldn't justify hiring a full-service agency for a 6-month project. The plan I developed wasn't just about graphic design anymore. It was about becoming a complete creative partner for businesses in transition, offering everything from brand identity development to website design, from packaging concepts to trade show materials. Instead of competing on price with other freelancers, I would compete on value and comprehensive service, positioning myself as the bridge between basic design work and premium agency services. The first step was to dramatically upgrade my own capabilities and equipment. I spent 3 weeks researching and comparing professional design software, high-end printers, and presentation equipment that would allow me to deliver work that looked indistinguishable from what the major agencies produced. The total investment would be nearly $8,000, more money than I'd ever spent on anything except my education, but absolutely essential if I wanted to compete at a higher level. I liquidated everything I could. The small savings account I'd been building for emergencies disappeared overnight. I sold my barely functioning television, my ancient desktop computer, and every piece of jewelry I owned except for the simple necklace my mother had given me for my college graduation. I even sold textbooks from my business degree, books I'd kept thinking I might need to reference someday but had never opened since graduation. The new equipment transformed my tiny studio apartment into something that resembled a professional workspace. The large format printer took up most of my kitchen counter, but it could produce presentation materials that looked like they'd come from a Fortune 500 company. The professional camera and lighting setup allowed me to photograph my work in ways that showcased the quality and attention to detail that smaller clients rarely saw in their design projects. More importantly, the investment forced me to raise my standards and my prices. I couldn't justify spending $8,000 on equipment only to continue charging $25 for business card designs. If I was going to operate like a professional agency, I needed to price my services accordingly and attract clients who understood the value of superior design work. The transition wasn't smooth. Several of my regular clients balked at the new pricing structure, accusing me of getting too big for my britches or forgetting where I came from. Mrs. Chen at the bakery was particularly hurt, explaining that she'd recommended me to other small business owners specifically because I was affordable and approachable, not like those fancy agencies that made people feel stupid for not understanding design terminology. Her words stung because they contained a grain of truth. I was deliberately moving away from the community of struggling small business owners who had supported me during my early days as a freelancer. But I also knew that staying in that market would keep me trapped in a cycle of barely sustainable income, constantly scrambling to find enough small projects to pay my bills while never building anything substantial enough to grow beyond my current limitations. The solution came from an unexpected source. Marcus Rivera, the owner of a small construction company, had hired me 6 months earlier to design business cards and a simple website. When I explained my new pricing structure and service offerings, instead of being offended, he became excited about the possibilities. "You know what my biggest problem is?" he asked during a meeting in his cluttered office, surrounded by blueprints and construction schedules. "I can't compete with the big contractors for major projects because my presentations look amateur. The clients see my work and they know I'm good, but when they compare my proposal folder to something from Hartman Construction, mine looks like it was put together by a high school student." That conversation led to my first major comprehensive project under the new business model. Marcus hired me to completely overhaul his company's professional image, from logo design and business materials to a sophisticated website that showcased his projects with professional photography and detailed case studies. The project fee was more money than I'd made in my previous 3 months combined, but more importantly, it demonstrated exactly what I could accomplish when I had adequate resources and a client who understood the value of professional presentation. The success with Marcus's construction company opened doors I hadn't even known existed. His general contractor referred me to an architectural firm that needed marketing materials for a new residential development. The architectural firm introduced me to a real estate agency that wanted to rebrand their luxury property listings. Each project was larger and more complex than anything I'd handled before, requiring skills I had to learn on the fly but building a portfolio that finally looked substantial and professional. 6 months after turning down Jessica's job opportunity, I was working with clients whose budgets allowed me to focus on quality rather than quantity. Instead of scrambling to complete 20 small projects each month, I could dedicate weeks to developing comprehensive branding strategies that transformed how businesses presented themselves to their customers. The work was more challenging and more satisfying than anything I'd done in my corporate job, even during the inevitable moments when I questioned whether I was in over my head. The biggest test came when I landed a project with Elevation Fitness, a small chain of boutique gyms that wanted to expand from 3 locations to 10 within 2 years. The owners, Sarah and Mike Kowalski, had built a successful business through word of mouth and community relationships, but they needed a sophisticated brand identity that could support their growth ambitions while maintaining the personal connection that made their gyms special. The project required everything I'd learned about balancing creativity with business strategy. I spent weeks observing their current operations, interviewing longtime members, and researching how other fitness brands had successfully scaled while preserving their core identity. The final proposal included logo refinement, color palette development, signage design, website overhaul, social media templates, and marketing materials that could be customized for each location while maintaining brand consistency. When I presented the comprehensive brand package to Sarah and Mike, their reaction was everything I'd hoped for, and more. Sarah actually got emotional as she flipped through the presentation book, seeing her vision for the company's future translated into visual elements that felt both professional and authentic to their values. "This is exactly what we've been trying to express but couldn't figure out how to communicate," she said, studying the proposed signage designs. "You didn't just design a logo. You captured the essence of what makes our gyms different from every other fitness center in the city." The Elevation Fitness project paid me more than I'd earned in my first year as a freelancer, but the real value was in the confidence it gave me about my abilities and the proof it provided that I could compete with established agencies on projects of significant scope and complexity. The work was featured in their grand opening materials for 2 new locations, and several other business owners approached me specifically because they'd seen the professional quality of Elevation Fitness's branding and wanted similar results for their own companies. But success brought new challenges I hadn't anticipated. Working on larger projects meant longer payment cycles and more complex client relationships. Some months I'd complete substantial work that wouldn't be paid for another 30 to 45 days, creating cash flow problems that required careful financial planning and occasionally some creative problem solving to keep my bills current. There was also the isolation that came with working alone on increasingly demanding projects. During my corporate days, I'd always had colleagues to bounce ideas off or help troubleshoot problems. Now every creative decision and business strategy was my sole responsibility, which could be exhilarating during successful moments but overwhelming when projects got complicated or clients became difficult. The solution came gradually as I built relationships with other independent professionals who were facing similar challenges. I connected with a freelance copywriter named Amanda Chen, who specialized in small business marketing materials. She'd left her job at an advertising agency around the same time I'd quit Pinnacle Consulting, and we discovered that our skills complemented each other perfectly on projects that required both visual design and written content. Our collaboration on a nonprofit fundraising campaign led to a formal partnership arrangement where we could offer clients comprehensive creative services that neither of us could provide alone. Amanda's expertise in strategic messaging elevated my design work, while my visual concepts helped her copy communicate more effectively with target audiences. Together, we could compete for projects that would have been impossible for either of us to handle independently. The partnership also introduced me to Amanda's network of freelance professionals, including a web developer named Jason Park who could build sophisticated websites around my design concepts, and a photographer named Lisa Santos, who specialized in commercial shoots for small businesses. Within months, we had an informal collective of independent contractors who could assemble into teams for larger projects while maintaining the flexibility to work separately on smaller assignments. This network approach solved several problems simultaneously. Clients got access to specialized expertise across multiple disciplines. Without paying premium agency overhead, we could take on more ambitious projects by combining our different skills, while still maintaining the personal relationships and competitive pricing that made us attractive alternatives to traditional agencies. And personally, I finally had colleagues again, people who understood the challenges and rewards of building creative businesses from scratch. The arrangement worked so well that we started meeting regularly to share resources and discuss potential collaborations. Our monthly gatherings at a coffee shop in the River North District became informal strategy sessions where we could troubleshoot difficult clients, share referral opportunities, and brainstorm solutions to the business challenges we all faced as independent professionals. It was during one of these meetings that Amanda mentioned a commercial property she'd noticed while visiting a client downtown. The building was being renovated by a developer who was specifically marketing to creative professionals and small business owners, offering flexible lease terms and shared amenities that made high-quality office space affordable for companies that were too small for traditional commercial leases but too established for purely home-based operations. "It might be worth looking at," she suggested. "The spaces aren't huge, but they're professional enough for client meetings, and the building is designed around the idea of creative businesses supporting each other. There's a shared conference room, professional printing services, even a photography studio that tenants can rent by the hour." The tour of Pacific Creative Commons changed everything I thought I knew about what was possible for my business. The building was a renovated warehouse in the up-and-coming Highlands neighborhood, with exposed brick walls, large windows, and an industrial aesthetic that felt both historic and cutting-edge. The individual units were small but efficiently designed, with enough space for a proper desk setup, client seating area, and storage for equipment and materials. More intriguingly, the building's concept was specifically designed around collaboration and mutual support among creative professionals. The shared amenities weren't just cost-saving measures, but genuine resources that could help small businesses operate at a higher level. The conference room could handle client presentations that would be impossible in my studio apartment. The printing services could produce large-format materials that I currently had to outsource. The photography studio could support product shoots and professional portraits that complemented my design work. The monthly rent was 3 times what I paid for my studio apartment, but the space would allow me to operate like a legitimate business rather than a hobbyist working from home. I could schedule client meetings without worrying about the unmade bed visible behind my folding screen. I could store professional equipment properly instead of cramming it into every available corner. Most importantly, I could present myself as an established creative professional, rather than someone still figuring out whether their business was real or just an expensive hobby. The lease application required financial documentation that made me nervous, but my tax returns from the past year showed steady income growth, and the bank statements reflected a business that was generating real revenue, even if that revenue was still modest compared to what Jessica made in her corporate position. When the building manager called to offer me a unit, I felt like I was crossing a threshold into a version of professional legitimacy I'd been working toward, without fully understanding what it would look like. Moving into Pacific Creative Commons marked the beginning of a new phase in my business development. Having a proper office space changed how clients perceived my work and how I approached each project. Instead of meeting at coffee shops or trying to squeeze into clients' crowded offices, I could host professional presentations in an environment that reinforced the quality and sophistication of my design services. The building's collaborative atmosphere also created unexpected opportunities. The tenant in the unit next to mine was a marketing consultant named David Hernandez, who worked with restaurants and hospitality businesses throughout Colorado. Our casual conversations in the hallway led to several referral opportunities where his clients needed design work that perfectly matched my capabilities and experience. More significantly, David introduced me to the concept of retainer relationships, where clients paid a monthly fee for ongoing design support rather than project-by-project billing. Several of his restaurant clients were constantly updating their menus, promotional materials, and seasonal campaigns, creating a steady demand for design services that traditional project billing couldn't efficiently accommodate. The retainer model transformed my business's financial stability. Instead of the feast or famine cycle, where I'd complete a major project and then scramble to find the next client, I had predictable monthly revenue that covered my basic expenses, while still allowing me to take on larger projects for additional income. The psychological relief of knowing that my rent and bills would be covered each month freed me to take creative risks and invest time in developing new services rather than constantly worrying about immediate cash flow. 18 months after moving into Pacific Creative Commons, Torres Design Studios had evolved into something that bore little resemblance to the struggling freelance operation I'd been running from my studio apartment. I had a roster of regular clients who trusted me with their most important branding decisions, a network of collaborative partners who expanded what I could offer, and a professional workspace that validated the legitimacy of what I'd built. But the most significant change was in how I thought about my business and my future. Instead of simply trying to make enough money to pay my bills while doing work I enjoyed, I was building something substantial and sustainable, something that could grow and evolve, and eventually support not just me but other creative professionals who shared my vision of what design could accomplish for businesses willing to invest in quality and strategic thinking. The sketch of the building that had seemed so impossibly ambitious 2 years earlier no longer looked like a fantasy. It looked like a plan, one that I was already well on my way to implementing. Not because I'd been lucky or because someone had handed me opportunities I didn't deserve, but because I'd been willing to risk everything on the possibility that my vision might be worth the effort required to make it real. Jessica still called regularly, usually to express concern about my unconventional career path and suggest that it wasn't too late to reconsider more stable employment options. But her arguments carried less weight now that I could point to concrete evidence of professional success. A lease on commercial office space, a portfolio of work for established businesses, and financial statements that showed steady revenue growth month after month. The woman who answered her calls was no longer the uncertain freelancer struggling to pay rent on a studio apartment. She was an entrepreneur who'd built something valuable from nothing but determination and a willingness to bet on herself when no one else believed the gamble was worth taking. And she was just getting started on the project that would either prove her family right about the dangers of unrealistic ambitions or surprise everyone who'd ever suggested she should be satisfied with smaller dreams. 2 years and 8 months after rejecting Jessica's corporate job offer, I stood in the marble lobby of the Meridian Tower, adjusting the portfolio case that contained the most important presentation of my career. The building stretched 34 floors into the Denver skyline, its glass facade reflecting the morning sun like a beacon of ambition and success. In exactly 20 minutes, I would pitch Torres Design Studios as the creative partner for the largest mixed-use development project in Colorado's history. The opportunity had materialized through a connection I'd never expected. David Hernandez, my office neighbor at Pacific Creative Commons, had been working with a restaurant group that was planning to anchor the retail space in Meridian Plaza, a billion-dollar development that would transform 6 city blocks into a destination combining luxury residential units, premium office space, and street-level commercial venues. When the developers realized they needed a comprehensive creative strategy to unify the project's visual identity, while allowing individual businesses to maintain their distinct brands, David had recommended Torres Design Studios. The preliminary meeting 3 weeks earlier had gone better than I'd dared to hope. The development team was impressed by my portfolio, particularly the Elevation Fitness expansion project, and a recent campaign I'd designed for a boutique hotel chain that had resulted in a 30% increase in direct bookings. But what sealed their interest was my understanding that successful placemaking required more than pretty graphics. It demanded a strategic approach to visual storytelling that could create emotional connections between people and spaces. Now, walking toward the elevator bank in my carefully chosen charcoal suit and carrying a presentation that represented months of research and planning, I felt like I was stepping into a completely different version of my professional identity. The woman reflected in the polished elevator doors looked confident and established, nothing like the uncertain freelancer who'd once defended her tiny apartment against Jessica's well-meaning criticism. The 28th floor conference room offered a panoramic view of downtown Denver, with the Rocky Mountains visible in the distance through floor-to-ceiling windows. 6 people sat around a glass table that probably cost more than I'd made in my first year of business. the lead developer, the project architect, the leasing director, 2 representatives from the investment group, and Sarah Morrison, the marketing executive who'd been my primary contact throughout the proposal process. "Michelle, thank you for coming in today," Sarah said, gesturing toward the chair at the head of the table. "We're all eager to see what you've developed for Meridian Plaza." I opened my portfolio case and activated the presentation system, my hands steady despite the magnitude of what this moment represented. The first slide displayed a rendering of the completed development, but overlaid with subtle design elements that demonstrated how visual consistency could enhance, rather than constrain, the project's diverse components. "Meridian Plaza isn't just a building project," I began, my voice carrying the confidence I'd developed through hundreds of client presentations. "It's the creation of a community, a destination that will define how people experience this part of the city for the next generation. The visual identity system I'm proposing will ensure that every element, from wayfinding signage to retail storefronts, contributes to a cohesive experience while allowing individual businesses the flexibility to express their unique personalities." The presentation unfolded like a story, each section building upon the previous one to demonstrate how strategic design could solve practical problems while creating emotional resonance. I showed them how consistent typography and color palettes could guide visitors through the complex without feeling restrictive. I demonstrated how flexible branding guidelines could accommodate both a high-end steakhouse and a casual coffee shop while maintaining visual harmony. I presented mock-ups of everything from parking garage graphics to rooftop event spaces, all unified by design principles that were sophisticated enough to support luxury retailers but approachable enough to welcome families and young professionals. But the most important part of the presentation focused on implementation and ongoing support. I explained how Torres Design Studios had evolved into a collaborative network of specialists who could handle every aspect of the project, from initial concept development through construction documentation and post-opening marketing support. I introduced my partnership with Amanda, Jason, and Lisa, positioning our team as a boutique alternative to the massive agencies that typically handled projects of this scope, offering more personalized service and faster response times at a more competitive cost structure. The questions that followed demonstrated genuine engagement rather than polite interest. The architect wanted to understand how my signage concepts would integrate with his building systems. The leasing director was curious about how the branding guidelines would affect tenant negotiations. The investment representatives focused on timeline and budget considerations, clearly evaluating whether our team could deliver on schedule and within the allocated resources. "This is exactly the kind of strategic thinking we've been looking for," the lead developer said finally, closing the presentation folder with evident satisfaction. "Most agencies focus solely on the visual elements without considering the operational implications. Your approach demonstrates that you understand this is fundamentally about creating value for tenants, visitors, and the community." Sarah Morrison leaned forward, her expression serious but encouraging. "Michelle, we'd like to move forward with Torres Design Studios as our creative partner for Meridian Plaza. The initial contract will be for design development and implementation support, with options for ongoing services once the first phase opens. Are you prepared to handle a project of this magnitude?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, testing whether I truly believed in the vision I'd been building or whether I'd retreat to the safety of smaller, more manageable projects. Everything I'd worked toward over the past 3 years had led to this moment, this opportunity to prove that the woman who'd walked away from corporate security to chase impossible dreams had the courage and capability to deliver on promises that once seemed absurdly ambitious. "We're absolutely prepared," I responded, meeting each person's gaze around the table. "This is exactly the kind of project Torres Design Studios was built to handle. We have the expertise, the resources, and the commitment to make Meridian Plaza a landmark that exceeds everyone's expectations." The contract negotiation took another 2 weeks, with lawyers reviewing every detail of scope, timeline, and deliverables. When I finally signed the agreement, the financial terms represented more revenue than I'd generated in my previous 2 years combined. More importantly, the project positioned Torres Design Studios as a legitimate competitor in Denver's commercial design market, capable of handling complex, high-profile assignments that would have been unimaginable when I was working from my studio apartment. The success of the Meridian Plaza project created a cascade of opportunities that transformed not just my business but my entire relationship with professional achievement. Other developers began approaching me directly, recognizing that the boutique agency model could deliver superior results for projects that required both creativity and strategic thinking. My network of collaborative partners expanded to include specialists in environmental graphics, digital marketing, and construction administration, creating a flexible team structure that could scale up or down depending on project requirements. But the most satisfying aspect of the transformation was the way it changed how I thought about success, and what was possible when someone was willing to bet everything on a vision that others couldn't see. The woman who'd been told to be practical and realistic had built something extraordinary, through nothing more than determination, and a refusal to accept limitations that were based on other people's fears, rather than actual impossibilities. 6 months after signing the Meridian Plaza contract, I was working late in my Pacific Creative Commons office when my phone rang with Jessica's familiar number. She'd been calling more frequently lately, our conversations gradually shifting from concern about my impractical career choices to genuine curiosity about what I was building. The corporate job she'd arranged for me had been filled by someone else, but she'd stopped suggesting alternative employment opportunities, perhaps recognizing that I was no longer the struggling freelancer who might need rescuing from her own ambitions. "Michelle, I have news," she said, her voice carrying an excitement I hadn't heard in years. Morrison and Associates just signed a lease for the top 3 floors of a new building downtown. The partners are planning a celebration next week, and they want to invite local business owners who've contributed to the city's economic development. Your name came up in the planning committee. I paused, trying to process the implications of what she was telling me. Morrison and Associates was one of Denver's most prestigious law firms, the kind of white shoe practice that only associated with established, successful businesses. If they were inviting me to their celebration, it meant Torres Design Studios had achieved a level of recognition and respectability that went far beyond my own industry. "That's wonderful, Jess. I'd be honored to attend." "There's something else," she continued, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "The building they're moving into? It's called Meridian Plaza." I looked it up, and apparently the whole development has gotten incredible reviews for its design and tenant experience. The articles I read mentioned that the visual identity was created by some boutique agency that really understood how to make commercial space feel welcoming and sophisticated at the same time. The irony was perfect, almost too perfect to believe. Jessica was praising the very project that had established my reputation as a serious creative professional, without realizing that her sister, the one she'd worried about for years, was responsible for the design excellence she was admiring from the outside. "Maybe you've heard of them," I said casually. "Torres Design Studios?" The silence that followed stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, Jessica's voice came through, barely above a whisper. "Michelle? Torres Design Studios? That's you?" "That's me. The boutique agency that designed the visual identity for Meridian Plaza? The signage and branding guidelines and tenant coordination? That was my team." I could hear her moving, probably walking to a window or pulling up information on her computer. "Michelle, this building is incredible. The lobby alone must have cost millions to design and build. The whole development has been featured in architectural magazines. You did this? We did this. Torres Design Studios, the company I built from that studio apartment you were so worried about. The company I started, instead of taking the corporate job you arranged for me." The conversation that followed lasted almost 2 hours, with Jessica asking detailed questions about how I'd managed to land such a prestigious project, how I'd assembled the team to execute it, and how I'd transformed from the struggling freelancer she'd been concerned about into an entrepreneur whose work was being recognized throughout the industry. Her tone had shifted completely, from protective older sister to professional peer, recognizing that what I'd built was not only legitimate, but genuinely impressive by any measure of business success. "I owe you an apology," she said finally. "I spent so many years thinking you were avoiding responsibility, when really you were building something I couldn't see. I was wrong about what you were capable of, and I was wrong about what success could look like." 3 days later, Jessica called again with a request that would have seemed impossible during our apartment confrontation years earlier. Morrison and Associates was planning to rebrand their practice to reflect their expansion into the new office space, and the partners had asked her to recommend a creative agency that could handle sophisticated legal marketing while understanding the nuances of professional services branding. "Would you be interested in presenting to our executive committee?" she asked. I know it's a little awkward, mixing family and business, but honestly, after seeing what you did with Meridian Plaza, I can't think of anyone better suited for this kind of project. The presentation to Morrison and Associates took place in their temporary conference room, since their new offices wouldn't be ready for another month. But even in the interim space, the meeting felt like a completion of something that had started years earlier with Jessica's judgment about my cheap apartment and impractical dreams. This time, instead of defending my choices, I was being invited to share my expertise with some of the most successful professionals in the city. The project they described was complex and challenging, requiring a complete visual overhaul that would position the firm for continued growth while honoring their 50-year history of legal excellence. It was exactly the kind of assignment that demanded both creative sophistication and strategic business thinking, the intersection where Torres Design Studios had learned to excel. When I presented my approach to their rebranding challenge, the room's energy was completely different from those early client meetings, where I'd struggled to convince small business owners that professional design was worth their limited budgets. These were people who understood that visual presentation directly impacted business results, that investing in quality creative work was a strategic decision rather than an unnecessary expense. The questions they asked demonstrated respect for my expertise rather than skepticism about my capabilities. They wanted to understand my process, my timeline, and my approach to measuring success, but no one questioned whether I was qualified to handle a project of this magnitude. The woman sitting at the head of their conference table was no longer the uncertain freelancer Jessica had worried about, but an established creative director whose opinion carried weight in rooms where important decisions were made. After the meeting, Jessica and I stood in the elevator together, heading down from the 16th floor toward the parking garage. She looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something that combined pride with a kind of wondering amazement. "You know what the strangest part is?" she said as the elevator descended. "All these years I thought I was the successful one. I had the prestigious job, the steady income, the impressive apartment. I thought you were struggling because you couldn't figure out how to succeed in the real world." She paused, staring at the floor numbers counting down. "But you weren't struggling to succeed in the real world. You were building your own world, one where success looks different than what I understood. And now you're operating at a level that most people in my firm would envy, including me." The elevator doors opened to reveal the parking garage, but neither of us moved to get out. Jessica was still processing the revelation of what I'd accomplished, while I was trying to understand how it felt to finally receive the recognition and respect I'd been working toward for so many years. "I'm proud of you, Michelle, not just for the business success, but for having the courage to build something that mattered to you, even when all of us were telling you to be practical and safe. You were right, and we were wrong, and I'm sorry it took me so long to see that." As I drove home that evening, through the Denver streets that had witnessed my transformation from corporate dropout to established entrepreneur, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. The sketch of the building that had once seemed impossible was now a reality, not in the literal sense of owning commercial real estate, but in the deeper sense of having built something substantial and enduring that bore my name and reflected my vision. Torres Design Studios was no longer just a company I'd started to avoid traditional employment. It was a creative enterprise that made a meaningful difference in how businesses presented themselves to the world, how developments welcomed visitors, how brands connected with their audiences. The work I did mattered to my clients and contributed to the visual landscape of an entire city. But more importantly, the woman who'd walked away from security to chase impossible dreams had proven to herself and everyone who'd doubted her that sometimes the most practical thing you can do is follow your impractical vision all the way to its extraordinary conclusion. The phone in my Pacific Creative Commons office would ring tomorrow with new opportunities, new challenges, and new chances to build something beautiful and useful in the world. Jessica would call to update me on Morrison and Associates' decision about their rebranding project. Amanda would stop by to discuss our next collaborative proposal. The ordinary magic of running a successful creative business would continue, day after day, project after project, building toward whatever impossible dream I'd be brave enough to sketch next. Up next, You've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.